You guys want to come around here? I want to do just a quick tour here of a few things that you're going to probably be interested in for the long haul. I'm going to do some recording too, if you don't mind, just because not everybody's going to be here. Some people couldn't make it, and these are just some things that are general in nature. Number one, this is kind of basically, what a hive is going to look like. And when you place your hive, ideally, some of the things you're going to want to think about is sunlight. You want as much sunlight as you can get. You want the entrance, if you can have it, face somewhere between south and east. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One of which is in the summer, it'll get the morning sun at the entrance, and the bees will get a little earlier start. And the earlier they start, the better they do in each day. The second thing is in the winter, our prevailing winds come out of the northwest. Cold winds blowing in, and you really don't want the entrance facing the prevailing winds in the wintertime. It just makes it that much harder for the bees to keep it warm. You don't want the hive resting directly on the ground. You want something between it and the ground. You need to have some kind of air circulation down here. And anything from a 4x4 to a couple of cinder blocks to a hive stand and anything in between, whether it's, in this case, 3.5 inches off the ground or 4, 5, or 6 inches off the ground, you do need that gap. And like I said, you need that air circulation that keeps moisture from collecting. It also keeps the wood from being in direct contact with the soil, and it keeps that from rotting away as quickly. You just put it on the ground, it'll rot quickly, it'll get wet, it'll collect moisture. It's just a bad thing. So you want a little gap. So facing the south to east, space underneath. You want to paint the exposed surfaces. At least I recommend that you paint them. You want to use an exterior grade paint. I don't use an enamel. I use a latex based paint, and I do that mainly because it's easier to clean up after you're done. Latex paints you can clean up with water, warm water, and so all your tools and stuff you clean up. But if you get a good exterior latex paint, that's all you really need to do. But you could use, if you'd rather use an oil-based paint or some people use polyurethanes, clear finishes if they get really nice looking wood and they want it to keep looking like wood, and that's fine too. But just keep in mind it needs to be exterior. Yep.
Do you put a primer on?
I do. If it's bare wood, I usually use a coat of primer. A lot of the exterior paints now say they have a primer built in. I haven't used any of those, but if that's the case, it should be fine. You oftentimes will need a couple coats if you really want to cover it. This, you can see it's not very pretty. This is an older hive, but yeah, I like to use primers. The next things to think about is when you paint, you do not need to paint the inside. In fact, I would discourage you from painting the inside. Now, I think today most of the paints that we have are pretty benign, but in years past they weren't, and they would give off toxic compounds for quite a while after they were painted. So if it's an interior surface, it doesn't need to be painted anyway. If it's not exposed to the elements, there's no reason to paint it. So if you look down in here, you'll see, I can show you, that bottom board, I paint the exposed landing board, and I paint the exposed sides, but I don't paint the interior surface. So you really don't need to worry much about, I just wouldn't paint the inside. So you got the bottom board, a deep box, an inner cover, doesn't need to be painted. And it won't always be configured this way. Sometimes they won't have inner covers. So we're going to look at and see what people have. And a telescoping cover. They call it a telescoping cover, again, because it telescopes out beyond the sides of the hive. They also make things that are called migratory covers. Migratory covers don't extend beyond on the sides. My preference is to have a telescoping cover like this, and the reason being when you get them stacked 2 or 3 high, this will have the water when it rains drop off and it doesn't run down the side of the hive, and where those high parts are put together, there's less opportunity for water to wind up inside the hive. And it's just a little easier for the bees to cure their honey if it's not wet in there, and it also reduces the amount of rot, and it'll hopefully make it last longer. Okay, so that's the hives. Got questions about any of that? Yes.
Ann and I were at her house, and there were some old hives, but and the hives had fallen down, but there were fiberglass. I think it was fiberglass covers.
Yes.
These covers. So it was made like this, where it comes out over, but it's made of fiberglass. Is
Plastic thing, yeah.
Plastic, some kind of plastic.
Yeah.
Is there any problem with using those plastic
No.
covers?
Those are probably Walter Kelly made. If it's not foam, it's hard packed plastic, right? Yeah. That's probably Walter Kelly's. They made them and may still have them. I don't know. They work fine. When you're harvesting honey, the ones that I've used, bees could sometimes get in from the outside, and so I learned not to use what are called bee escape boards with them. Bee escape boards, when you're harvesting honey, you'll have multiple boxes on, and you're going to take some off, but you want to get the bees out. And a bee escape board is kind of like a one-way door for bees. And so if you're going to take the top box off and harvest the honey out of it, you take that top box off, you put a bee escape on, you put that top box back on, put everything back together. And as the bees work their way out of that top box, they can't get back in it. And that gets the bees out, and they just take the box off and take it and harvest it. And it's kind of a neat idea. But with some of those plastic tops, bees could get in from the outside, and as that area was unprotected, then some of the neighborhood bees would discover that, and they would get in there and rob it. So if you're not using bee escapes, when you take your honey off, you'll be fine. But just think about that.
What's the advantage of an inner cover? You talked about an inner cover.
Yep, inner covers. If you remember the subject of bee space, we talked about bee space. Bee space is the space of about 3/8 to a quarter to about 3/8 of an inch. And for whatever reason, bees, if it's smaller than that, the space, bees will propolize it up, glue it up. If it's bigger than that, they'll put comb in it. And what that does is this allows, if you look at this indentation, this is bee space, this is about 3/8 of an inch. So it keeps the bees from attaching this to the top of the hive. Of course, if I'm being honest with you, they tend to attach this to the top of the hive, but you know, if it's properly designed, it should be designed so that there's bee space between the top of these frames and the bottom of this, and bee space from this to that. That's the way it should be designed. I'm not sure this is perfectly designed. That's the purpose of it. You had a question?
I did. The space underneath
Yep.
right here, is it best to leave it grass to deter? Is there anything that will deter from the beetles? Have sand been tried? Different?
I think
mulch?
people have tried everything on this earth, and it doesn't make much difference. The small hive beetles is what he's talking about, which is a pest. No doubt about it, a serious pest. And they pupate in the soil. So the beetles lay eggs in the brood area. The eggs hatch. They kind of run roughshod through the brood area. They make a mess. And those larvae then go down and get in the soil below the hive or somewhere near the hive, and they pupate in the soil and they emerge as adults. And people have put these things on concrete, and I don't even think that makes a difference, because the reality is beetles can fly and they can travel pretty great distances, and I don't even know where they come from anymore, but they seem to find hives. So they're just most of mine, I wind up weed eating beneath them, but I don't do much other than that. I try to keep, if you let the grass get too tall, it seems like they become more of a nuisance, but I don't think it's because of the pupating ones. I think it's, I'm not even sure what it's about. That's why we like our hives. One of the reasons we like our hives in full sun, for reasons I can't explain, the small hive beetles don't seem to do as well and become a problem or as big a nuisance when they're in full sun. If they're in a really shady spot, you know, then the small hive beetles are a problem. And if you worry about hives overheating in the summer, I've had hives in full sun several years ago in the summer when it was 103 or 4 degrees out, and that was the air temperature. So those hives were sitting in the sun and they were baking, and the bees can keep them cool. They can cool them. So,
So height is personal preference?
yeah, pretty much. You know, I like mine higher than this so I can get underneath them and weed eat. You'll see hive stands sold with hives a lot of times. Hive stands, if you look in the brochures, they put them on the ground, and they're still made of wood, so it'd be a thing that would be below this that would sit on the ground and elevate the hive. But I guess I don't care much about those because it's still wood, it sits on the ground, so it's prone to rot. It also is all enclosed, so you don't get ventilation, and then it also creates a cavity where snakes and mice and other creatures can nest, and I don't, you know, I just don't, I don't want them.
And what about around the hive? Is there a minimum amount of space around the hive? Like, I have a fence I'm thinking of putting it close to, because it gets that sun you're talking about.
Okay.
So how far from the fence?
What kind of fence are we talking about? Like
It's
a
a
privacy
privacy
fence? And would the entrance be facing the fence or facing away from the
Facing
fence?
away.
Facing away from the fence? Well, it doesn't matter. You want enough space you can get behind it, and I would leave enough space so that I could put equipment behind it if I was taking it apart. Because when you take it apart, when you work those bees, I'm on the back side of this, so there's a fence behind me, privacy fence behind me. I generally am going to work from the back. Because if I stand in the front, all the bees that are coming and going, I'm going to start to obstruct them, and the next thing you know, you got a gazillion bees backed up here behind you. And, you know, they just get confused, but they'll still be all over you, and then you start getting nervous because you got these bees all over you. And so you're better off to get behind it and work. So you need enough space to work. So I would say leave enough space behind it that you can put equipment on the ground behind it, okay? And as far as spacing of hives, if you have multiple hives, I would suggest that, you know, you put as much space as practical between them. The closer they are together, the more drift there is between them. But, you know, mine are butted up pretty close, and they still do okay. But if you space them a couple feet apart, it's even better.
I've got a hyperactive Doberman that I need to keep away from this thing, so I need to put a fence out, just a metal fence out around.
I bet he's still going to discover them, and they're going to discover him.
Is that good or bad? Because I have a hyperactive golden doodle.
They learn.
They learn.
The dogs learn pretty quick, you know. Any that I've had, you know, the first time that I had them and they were young and they were new, and they just go out with me, and the next thing you know, they've gotten stung a few times. And then before you know it, I walk out toward the hives and they stop about halfway and lay down and watch me from a distance. So they're pretty smart. They'll pick it up, and it may be a painful, you know, lesson, but they'll pick it up. We're going to talk just a second about some foundation. Does anybody have beeswax foundation for their hives? Oh, good. I may later do a demonstration of how to use that in a hive. It's extremely tedious. It's very technique oriented. And you'll find, you know, beekeepers don't do much of this anymore. And I do it some, but it is really a chore. And I would discourage you from doing it until you've kept bees for a while, and then if you want to dabble a little bit, you know, that'd be fine. This would be a sheet. These are in pretty rough shapes. The reason I brought them, because I figured I'd bang them up even more. That's a sheet, well, That's a sheet. That's a sheet, and it has reinforcements in it, and it has hooks on top. So as the metal wire comes up with a hook, and that's what you would put in an extracting, in a hive body or part that you were going to use to extract honey, and then the bees would draw comb out on it, and it just would have wax base rather than a plastic base. But like I say, it's very fragile, it's easy to damage, and it's a chore to work with, and so I just wouldn't put it at the top of my list of things. This is what's called thin surplus wax, and you notice it's not reinforced, but it's beeswax. And this is what you use if you want to have comb and cut it out and put in your jar with your honey. A lot of people, want their honey that way. Most beekeepers don't do this anymore because we've discovered just how valuable beeswax is. But if you decide to do that, you would put this in a frame, and it would be, well, the long and short of it is if you look at this frame that has some wax foundation, you see there's a split piece that's been separated and removed in there. That holds the top in place. Well, that uses those hooks on these metal bars to hold that in place. This doesn't have that. So the only way I've ever successfully used this is to build the frame, put it in place, and then melt wax and put drips along the top, along where they connect here. Because what happens is this will be in a hive with this kind of wax in it, and before the bees start to build comb on it, it'll be warm, and the wax will soften, and this will fall out. And it doesn't work. So just so you've got that in your mind, that if you decide you're going to do that, it is not a straightforward process, and you may want to think twice about it, or remember to call me and I'll remind you what it was that I did to make it work. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.